Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the music rating, ranking, and reviewing podcast that we like to call Music Meltdown. Actually, rate, rank, and review any artist's discography, songs, musical topics, really whatever comes to mind. This is the biggest one, the largest catalog I believe I've covered up to this point, and one of the best for sure. Of course, I'm not going to dwell on things for too long. We're doing David Bowie, one of the largest names in rock. You could argue pop, you could argue experimental music. Really, Bowie ran the gambit of basically any style he could get his hands on, and he's often described as a musical chameleon, which is entirely accurate. There pretty much was nothing that Bowie could do wrong. And Alex, what was your familiarity with Sir David Bowie?
Yeah, I knew who Bowie was for a really long time. Um, but as far as getting into his music, it was Blackstar that got me into it. I kind of was engrossed in all that kind of news coverage, the hype of the album, and obviously surrounding his passing and stuff like that. And I hadn't heard a full length Bowie album at the time. And yeah, it just kind of awoke me to his greatness. I've heard the entire catalog at least a couple of times now. Apart from Toy, Toy was the one that I hadn't heard before this because I never got around to listening to it when it came out. But yeah, I mean, he's incredibly versatile. I've always known that. But I think this latest listen really kind of awakened me to just how consistently strong his catalog is. And so he's gone from one of my most respected artists to, I think now I can genuinely say, one of my favorites. This was a really positive experience. It was really nice to properly sit with his catalog again because I haven't heard most of these albums in quite a while. But yeah, that was my experience. What was yours?
Nice. Glad to hear how well that went. I gotta say, going through this catalog, this is probably the quickest I've sped through any discography that I've done. I was listening basically three a day consistently, sometimes more, and I just couldn't stop. I finished this whole thing in maybe like a week, if that. So Bowie is basically intertwined with music for me. When I think of music, a lot of the time, I genuinely do think of David Bowie. He was the first musician. Him alongside an act like Elton John were basically the first proper artists that I was fully aware of. They were the ones that my older sister showcased to me, and it's just a part of my musical DNA at its core. So I can't really think of music without thinking of David Bowie because he was essentially the first proper musical act that I'd ever acquainted myself with. And yeah, I've gone through this whole catalog three times now and feel very strongly towards it, to put it lightly. So, not really much a bad word to say here. Who wants to kick this off?
I can go. Why not?
Sounds good. I figure I will mention one thing. We're doing 25 records, not counting pinups because it's a cover album, and not counting Buddha of Suburbia because who cares? David Bowie cares because of a very, very poor quote of his, perhaps his one lone misstep in his career is that quote.
Yeah. I just to acknowledge them very briefly before I start. Neither one would get very high on my list, but pinups at least I think I would recommend if you're just interested in hearing Bowie like do more covers and things like that. But it's to me it's pretty obviously the weakest of his 70s output. And Buddha of Suburbia is one of those things where I really like the ideas that he's throwing around on that album, but I don't think very many of them are fleshed out. So it's one of those things where I don't know, that would probably be like in the lower teens for me, and then pinups would be like in the early 20s or something like that. But um, I have heard the Tin Machine records. I don't have any desire to hear them again. That's all I'm going to say about those. Okay, I think we're doing five at a time still up till we get the top 10. So my number 25, this has changed since my previous list, but it is 1984's Tonight. Um, yeah, I Bowie doesn't have a bad record or really anything that close to a bad record. I just think this is incredibly bland and incredibly uninspired for the most part. It's a bunch of uninspired songwriting and covers mixed with this really flat production style. Now, to be clear, I have all the respect in the world for Hugh Padgham, and I think Hugh Padgham gets a lot of blame for this album, just as he does for something like Paul McCartney's Press to Play. Like, I think those are the two bad 80s records that are held against him. I don't blame him for either one. Number one, because Press to Play, if you read the backstory, you realize a lot of the bad decisions were McCartney's fault for the most part. The two of them did not get along during those sessions. But for this record, I mean, in a way, Padgham wasn't supposed to produce it. He was supposed to just be like the engineer or something. And then the first guy got into so many arguments with Bowie that he just walked out or whatever, and Padgham kind of cleaned up the mess. So I don't blame him, but it was a messy session, and you can really hear it. A lot of Iggy Pop co-writes on here. I haven't heard an 80s Iggy Pop album, but if this record is anything to go off of, I'm not going to prioritize it. Loving the Aliens, probably the highlight by process of elimination, but it's all relative. It's all relative, and it's oh so unimpressive. And the less said about the Beach Boys cover, the better. And even less said about that closing track, Dancing with the Big Boys, cannot stand it. One of my least favorite Bowie songs. So number 25, 2.5 stars tonight. Number 24, 2.5 stars for the 1967 self-titled. I have never liked this album very much. Again, I have respect for Anthony Newley. The guy wrote Pure Imagination, which is a song that I absolutely love from Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. But I don't have a desire to hear that style of music very often. And I certainly don't have a desire to hear imitators of said style. And that's exactly what Bowie does here. And at this point, Bowie is just kind of a mess artistically. He's just trying all these different things. He's part of all these various kind of rock acts and stuff. And I don't know. It just, he's kind of all over the place. And I don't think he's polished or proficient enough to make this material interesting. It's a good sounding record, although I think the orchestral arrangements are really amateurish. And I mean, Bowie's stage presence is good. I just don't think he adds a whole lot of character to these songs. I suppose my favorite on this would probably be Please Mr. Gravedigger, just because it's kind of macabre and I kind of like that. Number 23, 1987's Never Let Me Down. I am going up to 3 stars here. This was at the bottom for me. Surprisingly, not as bad as I remembered. The production is very dated. I mean, let's not mince words. The production is extremely dated, but it's a lot livelier compared to tonight. And I just kind of respect the fact that Bowie is throwing a lot of shit at the wall here. How much of it works? Not very much, but he's trying a lot of different things. I like Time Will Crawl okay. Zeros incorporates a lot of like traditional Indian instrumentation in a kind of bizarre way, but it kind of works just for the novelty of it. It's a messy album, but I think there's a level of merit there that I didn't recognize before. So I'm going to go very, very light 3 stars on that one. Number 22 is the archival release, 2021's Toy. I remember this album being sort of mythologized for a long time. Like people were talking about it as this like hypothetical, this lost Bowie release that's only popped up in some really shitty bootlegs. And I remember how surprised people were when it was announced they were going to release it officially, especially since, again, a lot of these songs were never properly bootlegged apart from like some really rough mixes, I think. And then it came out and I didn't get around to hearing it until just now, but it's songs from one of Bowie's weakest songwriting periods, maybe his absolute weakest, mid to late 60s, mixed with a production style that has a bit more edge than ours before it, but not substantially more. There's a bit more kind of compression here that's foreshadowing some of the 2000s Bowie records like Heathen and Reality. So it does not work. The two mixes, like these songs are not built for this type of production style. I do really like the re-recording of Conversation Piece, but there isn't a lot else here that I think works. I think it's better in theory than in execution. So that's my number 22. And my number 21 is where I lose everybody. This will probably be my most controversial take. 1975's Young Americans. This would have been higher before. This album actually did grow off me upon re-listen. Basically, what I have to say is that if this is earnest, if this is an earnest take on the Philly soul style, it's a bit embarrassing. If it's kind of a gimmick, if it's Bowie kind of playing his character or whatever, I don't find it very entertaining. Um, there are nice tunes on here. I really like Fascination, it has a great groove on it. The song Fame, I think, is kind of balanced out because John Lennon's offering some creative input and stuff. And Bowie's vocals are great on this album across the board. But a lot of this record, songwriting wise, I don't have any time for. It's cheesy as hell. And I think Bowie's ability to grab these songs by the horns and just kind of envelop himself in them is what prevents this record from being a complete failure, but it's teetering on the edge. It's really teetering on the edge. It's 3 stars, and it's probably a reasonably strong 3 stars because the parts that are good are really good. But no, this to me is aside from pinups, to me, this is the weak point of his 1970s catalog, and it's not even close.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. As you saw, I own the vinyl, so pretty big difference of opinion there. But I want to keep things brief, so I'll be silent. Number 25 is going to be Toy at 3.5 stars. I think every single Bowie album is at least good, which is not something I would have said before going into this. Although, to be fair, I have Toy at the bottom mostly because it does feel somewhat unfinished. It feels almost more as if it's a compilation of sorts. However, the highlights in terms of tracks are very strong across here. I think I Dig Everything is a really strong opener. You've Got a Habit of Leaving was very good. I agree. Conversation Piece is excellent. My favorite song on here would probably be Shadow Man or Let Me Sleep Beside You. The issue is after Hole in the Ground, it does kind of lose me a bit. And I just simply think as a proper album, it is near the bottom for me. And the exact bottom now. I would probably have Buddha below it, but didn't re-listen to it. So we'll see. This is where I lose some people. I know some people champion this album. I don't get it at all. My number 24 is going to be Space Oddity. Here's what I will say. Outside of the title track, I just simply don't think that this is a fully formed David Bowie. It's very folksy. It has some slight progressive elements to it, but simply put, it's just not necessarily the greatest sound for him, despite there being some great songs on here. Notably, I think Janine is a pretty solid highlight. I think Signet Committee, despite me not loving it, is pretty interesting for what it is. And of course, the title track is an absolute sensation. It's just simply not one of his highlights. And I think it's a stepping stone to what he would later become on future records. Up from here, another one I believe is somewhat contentious. Some people champion this album. I used to champion hard against this record. I have One Outside, which is the low point of the 90s for me, but it's still at 3.5 stars, so low point. Used to have this one at 2, but I think that was absolutely ridiculous. I've heard it twice now. And my real issue is mainly just length, and I do believe this is one of his less inventive records. You can very much tell he's inspired by like a Nine Inch Nails and the industrial scene that's going on. And while it's definitely good and it's not nearly as hard as that, and he would dig far further into that on Earthling and succeed a lot more, there's just some very, very good songs across here, with my favorite of which probably being Strangers When We Meet, which I think is excellent. I think some of the segues work really well across here, and the title track Outside is as well quite good. It really is just the length and the lack of inventiveness that puts it down for me. This is one that some people are going to be absolutely enamored that I have as high as I do, but you had it at a similar spot. Next up, I have Never Let Me Down. And I'll be brutally honest with you, I was tempted to go to 4 stars for this record. I think that this is an incredibly fun pop album. It is dated, it is 1987 cheese, and I do not give a damn. That is such a fun year for pop music. I think that these are just really over the top, just Bowie kind of doing a pastiche of what 80s pop music was. And it really works out very well. The title track is super fun. Time Will Crawl, Beat Your Drum. Zeros is, of course, the true highlight here. But for me, it's just an incredibly fun album. And while I do understand why some people would dismiss it and hate on it, I feel like you're kind of losing a bit of the point with that, because it's very clear that he was tired of the 80s pop sound. I feel like in some degree he was pressured to make the album. That could just be my own perception of it, however. And fifth from the bottom, I'm going with the other David Bowie self-titled album, his debut, I'm not sure what it is. As I mentioned before, I'm not the biggest fan of this sort of 60s pop sort of thing, but I think that Bowie does it in a very unique way. You already get a ton of his character on here. His voice is already incredibly well done and fully formed. And there's just a ton of fun music across here. Uncle Arthur is a great one. I really enjoy Sell Me a Coat. Love You Till Tuesday is an excellent song. And I really love whenever it gets a bit darker, a bit subversive within the Baroque stylings. It's a very unique album, and he would never do anything like it again, but I can't blame him for steering away from it. To draw it back to an album that we covered on a previous show, I'd say it's very comparable to Regimental Sergeant Zippo, except Bowie's doing it, and Bowie is simply at this point a better writer than Elton, I would say. So I just prefer this one. So those are my bottom five, all at 3.5 stars.
Dang. I would say one major disagreement in that list, and I think you already know what it is, but it'll be I suppose we'll have to wait and see to see where exactly I place it. Um, number 20, I'm going to go to 3.5 stars now for 1999's Hours. This is an album. I struggle with this one. It did grow on me. It's a bit inconsistent. It can't really decide if it wants to be this like sophistopop record in the vein of like Sting, or a traditional rock album with it's not sonically, but songwriting wise, having a foot left behind in how Earthling approached it. Like, I think you add the instrumentation to some of like the heavier songs, like you add that Earthling instrumentation, I think it could fit right in. Um, like I said, I do like it more than I used to. I think a lot of these songs are pretty doggone good, and I could see it growing on me even more over time. But as a cohesive piece, it kind of plods along. I don't think the flow is very good. The production has this sort of constant synth padding, kind of reminds me of Made in Heaven by Queen, that prevents it from developing any sort of an edge, really. That's kind of why, I mean, I like several songs, like Thursday's Child, I like, but The Pretty Things Are Going to Hell, probably my favorite on that album because it breaks the sonic consistency the most. But yeah, it's 3.5 stars, not a very high 3.5, but I do like it more than I used to. Number 19, an album that I advocate for a lot, and I'm a little bit sad that I couldn't get it higher. 1993's Black Tie White Noise. People have complaints about this one. This is at the bottom or near the bottom for many people. And I understand the complaints. The production style is more than a bit of its time. New Jack Swing has not aged well as a genre at all. And most of these songs do overstay their welcome a bit. A lot of them are pretty long, but from a textural standpoint, I'm gonna be honest. I'm kind of a sucker for what he's doing here. I really love the jazz influences on songs like "Looking for Lester," which features Mike Garson, my beloved, my favorite Bowie sideman, as we'll get into later. And even the more straightforward New Jack Swing on tracks like the title track does work pretty well enough. The title track is kind of funny because it's Bowie attempting to write Ebony and Ivory while consciously trying not to write something as cringy as Ebony and Ivory. And it works for the most part, I think. Jump They Say is fantastic, one of the best Bowie songs from the 90s. I also don't mind the covers on here. I Feel Free features a cameo from a terminally ill Mick Ronson that definitely serves as the backbone for a pretty funky take on the Cream song. I really like it. I also like Don't Let Me Down and Down as well. Just, it's a very fascinating album. It just maybe could have done with a little bit more quality control, slightly shorter songs for the most part. And I could, if you implement those, I could see it being a lot further up my list. That's one Nile Rodgers album. I'm going to have the other Nile Rodgers album right next to it. Number 18, 1983's Let's Dance, also at 3.5 stars. There's a lot about this record that's very strong. I really like the production on here a lot. Yeah, I have it on CD too. And vinyl, actually, for whatever reason. I like the production a lot. The hooks are really good. And I think it's a moodier and darker record than I think people give it credit for. Like, these are not happy pop songs for the most part. There's a little bit of an edge to them, dampness to them, I suppose. That said, I think this is one of those examples where one, I think it is very singles heavy. I think the singles are clearly the best songs on here. Um, I honestly barely remember the album tracks. And I think the singles, for as good as they are overall, benefit from the condensed single edits rather than the full length album versions, especially the title track. I'm going to be honest, I prefer the single edit of the title track significantly to the album version. It's good stuff. It's good stuff. And I don't agree at all with people who think that this is like a failure or it killed Bowie artistically. I think there's a lot of artistic merit here. But I don't love every single song. And the fact is, with Bowie's discography, like it's a bloodbath at the top. There's so much fantastic stuff. As we're gonna get to, because my number 17, I'm up to 4 stars now for 1969's self-titled / Space Oddity. I kind of agree with what you're saying in some level. I think it's an inconsistent album, which is its biggest, I think it's its primary flaw. Like Signet Committee, I think Signet Committee is a terrific song. I don't think it fits on the album at all. I think you have that song and like one or two others that feel very kind of progressive, like Memory of a Free Festival, I think is the other one where they kind of clash with the really nice kind of folky country stuff like Letter to Hermione, which I adore. I love that song. Kind of reminds me of the self-titled Elton John album from the next year. We keep making the Elton John comparisons, but I think there's merit there, especially because some of the same people are involved with the production of both records. Still some sonic and songwriting connections to the debut album, but my God, I think it improves on it in every imaginable way on some level. So yeah, inconsistent album, but the high points are really high. And I haven't even mentioned the title track because everybody knows it. I don't think I really need to say that much about it. So it's a light 4 stars, but it is 4 stars. And then number 16, another album that I wanted to get higher, but it's too hard. 1997's Earthling, an album that at one point was knocking at the door of my top 10, but has grown off me a little bit. It is Bowie's most abrasive album, inspired by jungle music often, although it's not always as across the board inspired by that as that kind of stereotype would have you believe. People say it is his drum and bass album, and the fact is it's not that intense all the time. You have songs like 7 Years in Tibet, which have these much quieter verses that kind of stabilize the mood a bit. But that said, like it is a more dynamic album than people give it credit for. But the intense stuff is what I come to it for. I come to it for Dead Man Walking, which is fan-fucking-tastic, possibly my favorite Bowie song from the 90s. I'm Afraid of Americans, kind of that last hurrah with Brian Eno. It's just a lot of, it's a great driving album is what it is. You sink your teeth into the meat of the record and there's not as much there as maybe I would like, but man, the intensity of it. I remember listening to this for the first time and just kind of blowing my mind because I had never heard a drum and bass album before and just being like, wow, that's powerful stuff. That's powerful. So yeah, 4 stars. I love it, but I think there's 15 better albums is where we're at here. So yeah, Earthling at number 16.
Yep. A couple of those hurt me, but this is going to be my most controversial, I think. I don't know. I have a couple of doozies in this list. So at the bottom of this batch, I'm still at 3.5. I have Diamond Dogs. Here is what I will say. I've always had issues with this one, mainly because you can absolutely feel the scatterbrained nature of how it was put together. This is one of the few records Bowie is exclusively doing guitar on, I believe. Mick Ronson had left the group as well. He was trying to get like a stage play made from something, which turned into the beginning of this album. Then you have all the more stereotypical glam rock stuff that would kind of, make for a safer album. And it's just really bizarre, to be blunt. It feels like the first Future Legends through Sweet Thing Reprise as its own EP, and then Rebel Rebel through Big Brother as its own EP. And then whatever the hell Chant of the Ever Circling Skeletal Family is, because I have no clue what that's supposed to be. The issue, when this album bops, holy fuck, it bops. Rebel Rebel obviously is the big one, but that might not even be in my top 5 on the album. 1984 is the first example of funky Bowie, and it is absolutely incredible. And one of my all-time favorite Bowie songs is Big Brother. Title track here is also excellent. And I don't know, it really does simply fall to the bottom because I don't think it's nearly as consistent as some of his other releases. And just that's all that drops it because I only have one more 3.5 above it. So next up, this one is a weird one for me. I have Heathen. I want to like Heathen a lot more than I do. I feel like it's his most adventurous. It's definitely one of the more artier albums in his career, bordering on almost a bit of an ambient sound, as opposed to the back halves. There's a ton of space within the tracks, and they really move at kind of a crawl, but it's really excellent. And I don't know what it is about this one. I think every song on this album is good, and I really enjoy listening through it, but just something about it doesn't quite connect with me on the same level as some of his other releases. And I don't quite know how to describe it because tracks like Sunday, I adore Slip Away, Slow Burn. I think his cover of the Pixies Cactus is really good. I Took a Trip on a Gemini Spaceship. There's plenty of incredibly strong songs on here. It just, as a full record, it doesn't have quite the feeling that I want from the Bowie albums, despite me still happily listening to it anytime. It's one that I struggle to put my mind around, and I could definitely do with a re-listen even now. However, going up from here, I'm at 4 stars with an album that I did not expect to be this high. I've championed this one for a while, but never to the degree that I am now. I have Tonight. I don't think that this is that much weaker than Let's Dance, if I'm being honest. Past the singles, obviously, but I think that there are some very good deep cuts here. Of course, the opener, Loving the Alien, is absolutely excellent. I think Don't Look Down is very strong. I like the title track. Neighborhood Threat is a ton of fun. Blue Jean is a great pop song. I keep forgetting another good one. I will say one thing. I used to very much be on your side with the God Only Knows cover. I used to hate it for a very long time. I absolutely loved it this go around. I don't know what it is. I just think that he is able to interpolate songs in a way that simply no other artist is able to do. It's just incredibly impressive how much he's able to elevate every song that he touches. And I'm not going to say elevate. The Beach Boys version is better than the Bowie version. However, I still do think that the Bowie version has plenty of merits. However, this is where we get into some contentious stuff. I'm at 4 stars, by the way, if I didn't already say it. Right above here, I want to mention this is where things get incredibly challenging. Pretty much from this album all the way to my number, I think 11, could really be flipped around in many different ways. I'm sorry for this. Next up, I have Heroes. Heroes. Here is my thing. I think that there are some absolutely incredible songs on here. Beauty and the Beast is a great opener. Joe the Lion, Sons of the Silent Age, I Love the Secret Life of Arabia. I'll come out and say it. Moss Garden is perhaps my favorite ambient track of all time. I absolutely adore that song. Arguably my favorite on the album. And the real reason why I don't love this one, I'm sorry, bite that tongue, man. I've never gotten the title track. I think it's a good song, but for me, I don't think that it's one of his more emotive vocal performances, personally speaking. And I feel like the build is kind of a crawl. It doesn't really feel like it ever fully erupts for me because this album feels very dark. The sound of it is very black, if you will, in comparison to something like Low, which is a lot funkier, and in comparison to something like Lodger, which is a lot bouncier, has a lot more groove to it. This one feels very pitched. This was the only one fully recorded in Berlin, and that could be a reason why. And I do feel like it kind of limits how much the tracks can really grow and develop. I still think that they're all very, very good, mind you, except the title track, but I'm on an island for that, so I won't fight it too hard. It's a very good album. It just, David Bowie has 18 albums at 4 stars or higher. I can't think of another artist with a catalog this consistent. And then the one moving right up from me, very funnily, is going to be The Next Day, which, look at those covers. Look at me doing a cheeky thing. But no, The Next Day, it's basically his take on sort of that modern 2010s indie rock. You could definitely draw comparisons to a group like TV on the Radio on here. And I think that's pretty great. You can as well hear he's experimenting a bit with the Berlin era once again, especially in the back half after Valentine's Day. I feel like you get those sort of low, those heroes textures a ton. But really, it's just that opening, those opening three songs, as well as Valentine's Day, which just absolutely knocked this record out of the park. The opening the next day is fantastic. Dirty Boys continues it excellently. Stars Are Out Tonight is another beautiful one. And Valentine's Day might be my favorite Bowie song of the 2010s. Blackstar has a lot of contenders for that, but I think that song is just absolutely outstanding. And as well as songs like You Will Set the World on Fire is a really fun one. This was an album that, going back, actually shrunk on me a bit. So I wanted to re-listen to it because I had this at the bottom, which was absolutely insane to me, it felt like. So I had to go back to it, and I was really just taken aback at how much I enjoyed it. So 4 stars, and I believe that rounds out my next batch of 5.
Okay, so I'm gonna take a second here. We part of for context reviewers, like the whole goal of this was to like record this in about 2 hours because I need to go to bed or whatever the hell. But I need to take a second, like just to acknowledge the placement of heroes. I think I think the thing and the reason why that is such a scorched earth take is like it's not that like I think if you had placed heroes at number 17, I think it was, and you had said, I love the title track, but I think the title track carries the record and I don't love everything else. I think people would be very confused and frustrated, but would forgive you.
Yet I fucked it worse by saying that's the part that I don't enjoy.
Exactly. Like you flipped it on its head and now people are going to like, I anticipate greatly reading the comment section of this video. I think this is going to be absolutely amazing.
It says a lot that in the track elimination, in the final round, I was the only person to vote against Heroes. So
yes,
rightfully so too.
Yeah, no, interesting take. Yeah, we won't get to Heroes for quite a while, obviously, on my list. But what we will get to at number 15 is 2003's Reality. Very similar album to Heathen in some ways, but arguably a bit more of like an acoustic record and a bit less keyboard heavy than Heathen is. I feel like on this record, you can really feel Tony Visconti pushing Bowie away from the 90s influence that Eno and others had kind of laid upon him and put him into like 2000s alt rock. Or whatever genre you want to call it. Side note, by the way, Tony Visconti, one of the great producers of all time, just in general. Like, we'll, give Bowie every credit in the world. He deserves it. But let's give Visconti a ton of credit. Like, this guy is an amazing musical talent and has been since the 60s. So, yeah, Reality. Again, it's one of those cases where I just happen to like 14 Bowie albums more than this, but there's a lot of really strong tracks on here. I really like the opening track. His cover of Pablo Picasso may be my favorite cover that he's ever done, apart from one, which we'll get to. Absolutely fantastic. I really like Looking for Water. It has this kind of chant-like hook that I enjoy. And Bring Me the Disco King. Maybe it gets a little bit, kind of noodles around a little bit longer than maybe will keep most people's interest, but I like the jazz exploration. I like anytime Bowie finagles around with jazz because it's evident that he understands it on some level. And I think a lot of people, a lot of pop artists who dive into jazz do so without having a fucking clue what they're doing. So yeah, 4 stars for Reality, number 15. Number 14, I have 1974's Diamond Dogs. It's very interesting. Bowie he's certainly doing some interesting things on here. And I like the concept overall. Like, I like what he's trying to do. But I do find it a bit messy compared to the ideas that came before, the Ziggy Stardust and the Alladin Sane ideas. And I do tend to miss the Spiders backing band quite a lot here. That said, I think Bowie stands in very well on guitar for the most part. He's not the technician Mick Ronson was, obviously, but I do like that kind of repetitive, maybe slightly punk flavored guitar riff in Rebel Rebel 1984 has that very kind of apocalyptic disco feel that's disturbingly infectious. Um, and Sweet Thing. Um, Now, this might be a contentious opinion, and maybe this is my anti heroes take, if you will. Sweet Thing to me is the best vocal that Bowie ever put on record. Um, and I know people praise Heroes a lot for that, and people praise Life on Mars a lot for that. I think those are kind of the big two as far as his vocals go. But Sweet Thing, from a technical standpoint, how he explores his range and different tones and the belting that he does is like insanely good. It's a more controlled vocal than Life on Mars and Heroes, where he's just kind of screaming those high notes. And yeah, it blows me away every time he does that, and I'm scared, that bit with like the vibrato and whatever. Love it. Fantastic song. And pretty great album overall. Number 13, 1970s, The Man Who Sold the World, 4 stars. Yeah, Bowie gets a proper band behind him finally, and it's an absolutely fire one right off the bat. All the love to Mick Ronson. Like, let's spotlight his guitar playing for a bit. But I was talking about Tony Visconti earlier. Let's give some love to this man's bass playing. He plays around with grooves and tones a lot here, and I just adore his approach. Very jammy record, kind of, I mean, in some ways, probably the only Bowie record that really falls under that descriptor. But I like it. I like it as kind of, again, another bit of an odd duck in his catalog. The title track is obviously great. Width of a Circle is obviously great. But one song I'll defend that some people won't is After All. I really like how it takes kind of the psychedelic elements of the Space Oddity record and makes them tighter, yet even more eccentric somehow with those really kind of goofy backing vocals and the synth sounds. I really like that song a lot. So, very strong album overall. One that I always kind of underrated. That was one that's always kind of flown under the radar for me, but I really grew to appreciate it more this time around. Number 12, 2002's Heathen. Very strong 4 stars on this one. This is in some ways kind of a return to more of the frenetic instrumentation of Outside and Earthling at times. But there is also a sense of reflection here that keeps things calmer. Bowie doesn't really feel like he's transitioned fully into his aging rock star period here, but he's certainly like hinting at that. Like he's covering much more mature themes than he used to. Tracks like Sunday and 5:15, The Angels Have Gone in particular are super morose, and songs like A Better Future and the very obscure cover, I Took a Trip on a Gemini Spaceship, hint at this kind of like almost social commentary in a post 9/11 world. I think in a way this record is interesting in that he may be getting older, but he's still not content. He's still very restless. He's still very opinionated. And I think that's what makes this album work better than a lot of other, again, quote unquote, aging rock star records. I really like the Pixies cover Cactus, Slow Burn, like you mentioned. A lot of strong songs on this album. So it comes in at a very strong 4 stars and at number 12. At number 11, we're up to 4.5 stars, which is pretty incredible. I kind of wanted to get this in the top 10, but it's tough. 1979's Lodger. This album is cursed by its association with Low and Heroes. I think if people weren't so caught up in those comparisons and comparing them to two of the best albums in the 70s, in my opinion, it would be much more highly regarded if it wasn't living in those records' shadow. It's a bit off kilter, a bit unhinged at times, much messier than the other two Eno records, but that sort of allows Bowie to drop into these other stylistic areas that he doesn't explore much in other records. There's I get a lot of talking heads at points on this album, and how he explores with like quote unquote world music, if you want to use that label, which makes sense since I mean that's literally what was doing with the Heads at this point. Um, Look Back in Anger has a super propelling rhythm behind it that I love. DJ is great. I adore African Night Flight. I think that is a fantastic and delightfully unhinged song. Just there's a lot of greatness on this record. It's maybe more trivial, if you want to use that word, than other Bowie albums, but it is endlessly entertaining and incredibly inventive. And yet it's number 11 because there's 10 albums better, in my opinion.
I wanna preface this by saying I think you should hold on to something for this next batch of 5 because oh boy, I'm sorry in advance. To start out, all these are gonna be 4 stars, so still got a couple more 4s to knock through. 15 for me, I have Hours. I believe this was 99, and I just think this is a very pleasant record, very much. I would say after Hunky Dory, Bowie rarely ever really wrote from a personal point of view. He was very character driven. I would say this is probably the closest you get to that until a record like Blackstar, where he's definitely laying it all out there. And in some ways, it's very much just kind of his most straightforward sort of. I won't say folk because it's more rock driven, but you get what I mean when I draw that comparison. It's very intimate, it's very soulful. He's laying himself out there, and these are very good songs. Thursday's Child is lovely. The Pretty Things Are Going to Hell, Age is a Promise. And I really enjoyed the close of The Dreamers a lot. Plenty of just really enjoyable stuff on here. I think it gets a bit overshadowed because of where it falls in the catalog. Late 90s, not necessarily revered as a high point in Bowie's career, which, as you can tell, on my list, don't necessarily agree with, but I do think that that is a very good album. Or 14, another one, I wanted to get this one a lot higher, and I'm actually surprised I have this one a fair bit higher than you. I have Black Tie, White Noise. Very much his new Jack Swing record, brought back, blanking on producer's name.
Nile Rodgers.
Yep, Nile Rodgers. There you go. And it's really interesting because it's very different from Let's Dance. You can tell Bowie is definitely trying to expand a bit more. I believe he had just gotten married to his new partner, who was a woman of color, and he was wanting to explore that realm a bit more with New Jack Swing, with a more, kind of the resurgence of his plastic soul, if you will, on this album. And I will admit it is ungodly dated. Songs are just so fucking good on here. Like you mentioned, his cover of I Feel Free is great. Title track is really good. Jump They Say, another lovely one. Miracle Good Night, Don't Let Me Down and Down. But it really is his closer of Morrissey's I Know It's Gonna Happen Someday, which is really just a total knockout, an absolutely incredible song, and possibly maybe even as high as like a top 10 Bowie song. It's by far my favorite cover that he did. I think it is absolutely outstanding. This is where things get tough. And at my number 13, is it 13? Yeah, 13, 12, 11. This is where I have Low. Here's what I will say. I have it at 4 stars. I think it is very good, and it grew on me. I will say Low onward are knocking at the door of 4.5 stars. I still think that this is a very good album. However, it simply doesn't personally resonate with me on the level that some of his others do. Perhaps on this one, it's because of the ambient side. I've always said that I prefer Hero's ambient side personally, although I still think that this is an incredible piece of art. The first half, though, is incredibly interesting. You bring up Talking Heads. I think that they are a clear comparison to the entirety of the Berlin trilogy. His sort of rapid energy, sort of eccentric personality, it could definitely be compared to something of a David Byrne in the style. A track like A New Career in a New Town, Speed of Life, Sound and Vision. I've always loved Be My Wife. And the ambient side, it's hard for me to really properly describe ambient music as a whole. I say that this one has less individual moments that I could pick out and really say that I love, for example, like a Moss Garden. However, I still think that it's just a really great thing to listen to front to back. It's only 40 minutes. I do think that both this and Heroes suffer from it being so hard panned one side to another. I understand why it has to be that way, but at the same time, I do feel like it interrupts the flow of the album a bit. to clarify, it's still a very strong 4 stars. Like, it's very good, and I totally understand why people would love it. Probably your number one is what it is. Going up from there, I have The Man Who Sold the World. This is essentially Bowie's hard rock album, heaviest he ever got, and it is just really incredible. The opening 3 songs, At the Width of a Circle, All the Madman, Black Country Rock, are all just, in my opinion, hard rock classics. Bowie is able to really encompass that sort of heavy electric blues that was going on around this time, adjacent to like a Cream or a Zeppelin, and it's just really excellent. Mick Ronson, as you said, this is really the highlight of him in the entire catalog, I would say. He has better individual moments, but for a full album, just his guitar tones, his playing, and the riffs that he's able to knock out on here absolutely blow me away. But it really is the title track that knocks me off my feet every time. I've said before, it is my favorite Bowie song. That's too hard to pick. I would definitely take it over the Nirvana version, but it is still just an excellent song. This is where things get tricky, and I do another whoopsie doodles. My number 11, I have Station to Station. Here's what I'll say. Alex, you can face palm now, because I've also never loved this title track. I think that it is a very good song. It is 10 minutes long. It's Bowie's epic, and I understand why people love it. I think the first part of it goes on a bit too long. It drags a bit for me. I think after then it becomes very strong. And really, it's the bulk 2 through 6 that I think are absolutely immaculate. Golden Years is an incredible borderline pop song. I love Word on a Wing. I think TVC 15 is one of the funkiest, one of his most fun numbers ever. Stay, again, one of his best vocal performances. And the way that it closes on Wild is the Wind. I would say this is essentially just Bowie and a bunch of friends just jamming in the studio, knocking out these incredibly funky, incredibly well-layered material. And it really is just that one moment of the title track that I don't love that knocks it down to 4 stars and at my number 11. I totally understand why this could be somebody's number one, because it is an excellent release. It's just Bowie has so much great material all across his catalog. I do think in some spheres his 70s work maybe gets a bit overstated in how great of a catalog he has. As you've noticed, I have some 90s, I have some aughts. I believe I have an album from every decade except the 60s that he operated from in my top 10, because some people say, the 70s Bowie, he has some cool stuff later on, but he really fell off in the 80s, or his 90s work isn't as exceptional. And I just don't think that that's fair. He's truly an exceptional artist at every point in his career, regardless of what you may say about that. Number 11, Station to Station. Very, very strong record.
Yeah, I agree with that last point, which is probably about the only thing I agreed with in the entire monologue that you just had. But no, his consistency across eras is, I don't know if I want to say untouched, but it's hard to say very many other artists have equaled it. Yeah, I think just going through my list, I think the only decades I don't have represented are 60s and the 2000s. And the 2000s are very close to being represented because Heathen was almost a 4.5. And I'm pretty sure we each have records from each other's bottom 5 in our top 10, which is interesting. But I'm going to get rid of mine right away. My number 10 is 1995's Outside, 4.5 stars. I wanted to get it higher, but I couldn't reasonably because there are flaws. It's incredibly long. I do think the segues bog it down a bit. I do like them, kind of like what you were saying. Like, I like how they add, and I think if someone were to say I can't fucking stand the segues, I would say, yeah, I understand where you're coming from. And I don't think there's much in the way of hooks or melodies on this album. This might be the least melody heavy Bowie record, but the atmosphere here is like second to none. I think this is like the industrial sounds that he's going for here are incredible. There are some songs like We Prick You that serve as precedents for what Bowie would do on Earthling a couple years later. And a lot of the actual like song structures and musical ideas feel like they build off in some ways what he was already doing on Buddha Suburbia. I mean, literally Strangers When We Meet comes from Buddha of Suburbia. And I like that because, like I said, Buddha contains quite a few grittier ideas, even if they're not fully explored. And I think outside is what happens when he fully explores those ideas. I like the concept so much as I can understand it, which admittedly isn't very much. And I think Reeves Gabriels and Carlos Alomar bounce off each other super well on guitar. Bowie does a lot of things with like two guitars or two guitarists that I think works super well, as we'll find out in other albums too. Mike Garson is back to excellent effect on songs like A Small Plot of Land. Um, Hello Space Boy, I think, is fantastic. Really like The Motel. Um, and Strangers When We Meet, obviously. It's really long, but I don't think it feels its length when you're just kind of engrossed in the atmosphere of it. And frankly, I don't think you have to follow the story. I can't really follow the story, but I still love the thing because it sounds fucking cool. So, number 10, 4.5 stars. Outside, a record that, by the way, because you mentioned that when you first heard it, it was a 2-star record, and now it jumped up to a 3.5-star record. That's kind of the similar progression to what I had. It was a 3-star record when I originally heard it, and it was near the bottom. And on my second listen, it jumped up to a 4.5-star. And I think to this day, I've never had an album grow on me that quickly. But something clicked, and yeah, it's top 10 now. So, woohoo!
Ooh, glad to hear it, but I've said some blasphemous, some downright silly things already on this. Let's address yours. At number 10, knocking out the other bottom 5, Young Americans. I do understand where you're coming from. I will say I have heard other Philly soul albums. This is not a Philly soul album. He is trying, and good job, David. But no, you did not succeed if that was what you were trying to make. But in a way, I don't think that is what he was trying to make. I think he was very much trying to bring his own flair into this sort of scene of music that he very much enjoyed. Hence why he refers to it as, his Plastic Soul era. And truthfully speaking, but really it's just the songs on here that really pull it together. These are incredible. It's an incredible group of musicians that he brought together here. Backing vocals, of course, are as well excellent. And it's just the track listing. This review is awful because I got sidetracked. The title track is absolutely sensational. I think Win is very good. I've always loved Fascination. I'll admit very much it does sort of fall into a mood at a certain point. There's not really too much to remark about a track like Right or Can You Hear Me? The issue, every other track fucking slaps like crazy. Fame is a single and a half right there. I love his cover of Across the Universe. I understand why people are less high on it. I will say it's a very strange vocal performance from him. He never really does that sort of weird, I'm not sure if it's like he's like a chest voice sort of thing, because it seems like he's singing very deep in his range. It's just perplexing to me because I feel like if he sang it a bit more upfront, because he's got that kind of like nasal quality like John Lennon has, it could have really worked out in a really beautiful cover. However, he's trying to sound like a damn Cookie Monster, and so you are not Tom Waits, so I don't get what you're doing. And the real standout track here, I think, is Somebody Up There Loves Me, which is just a really great sort of funky number. And that's really all that this is. It's funky Bowie. I'll love me some funk. I'll love me some David. Can't go wrong with it. I understand where some of your complaints may draw from, but I don't think that they're right. So number 10, Young Americans. I am at 4 stars though. Still, I don't think it's like an all-time classic of his. It is very good though. So 4 stars for Young Americans.
All right. Yeah, I think it's fair. And I think, I've had a moment of appreciation with every Bowie album to some extent. And that moment hasn't come yet really for Young Americans, but I phrase it as a yet. I'm sure one day it will click with me and I will love it and it will be in my top 5. Maybe not top 5, but top 10 maybe. We'll see. But not today. Number 9, talking about albums growing on me, though, there were several that grew on me quite a bit, and this was one of them. 2013's The Next Day. This is an album that I kind of always underestimate, I think. I listen to it, I really like it, and then I don't forget about it, but I don't none of the tracks stick with me as obviously. I don't think there's quite the clear highlights on this album that there are in a lot of Bowie's other stuff. I think this is a very even record for the most part, but it's even in the best way because I think damn near every song on here is really, really good, bordering on great. Um, and because of that, it's an album that got a lot of acclaim when it was released and a lot of hype because it was like, oh my God, surprise Bowie album after 10 years. Like, who'd have thunk? But obviously, with the stuff that's come afterwards, Blackstar specifically, this record's kind of been buried a little bit. Um, and that's kind of unfair. It's because, as I said, it's a very strong, very consistent set of songs. Um, very different kind of production style here. I think more straightforward, um, straightforward rock, I guess. A little bit better produced, I think, than maybe Heathen and Reality were. In my opinion, the best lyrics to a Bowie record in I don't know how long, um, possibly best ever. Like I'd be willing to make that case. The title track is a mood setter, gives off this real sense of rebirth. And when I say rebirth, I mean rebirth in like the Lazarus sense, where it's like I'm coming back from being dead, quote unquote. Which I mean, Bowie was invisible for 10 years. He was completely off the scene, and he had a heart surgery during that time. So, he did nearly die while he was, on that hiatus. Um, so yeah, I mean, it gives off this like sense of like refreshment, but at the same time, Bowie's not avoiding the acknowledgement of death here. He's 10 years older than he was on Reality. A lot of those same considerations remain the same. However, you get the sense that he's more at peace with everything here. Like he's kind of at peace with the fact that he is old and that his time could come at any moment. It's not as obvious, it's not as painfully obvious as it is on Blackstar, but it's there in the lyrics. And I think that piece liberates him artistically. So I think this is a very freeing album. Um, yeah, I could name off damn near every song as a highlight. If we're talking about major highlights, I guess, like The Next Day, Stars Are Out Tonight, Valentine's Day, Dancing Out in Space, I guess. A lot of, it's hard to say. It's a really strong set of songs, and one that um, you know, I need to sit back and give it its due because it's really, really strong, really consistent, and you know, could have been the best Bowie record of the 2000s of the 21st century, but it's not because there's one other one that we have to talk about at some point. But number 9, 4.5 stars.
Absolutely. And I suspect we'll both be talking about it very much later because let's see. Next up for me, in my opinion, easily Bowie's most underrated album. I do not understand the distaste some people have for 1997's Earthling. It's my final 4-star album. I was very tempted to go up to 4.5. I can't quite do it. It's a very much. I know that you said that it's not his drum and bass album, but in a lot of ways it is. It's the one where he's the most directly pulling from industrial, and he's really working alongside his Trent Reznor connections upon this album. And truth be told, I think that this is one of his best written albums in general. Songs like Little Wonder, I'm Afraid of Americans, Dead Man Walking are incredibly written songs. And I don't know, just something about Bowie tackling this style because he does it in a very unique way. Draw a very weird comparison. For another video, I had to listen to Antichrist Superstar by Marilyn Manson, in which Trent Reznor produced that. And to be blunt, that record is fucking awful. It's essentially some little white tough boy just sort of raw, or I'm going to beat you up over some kick-ass Nine Inch Nails Trent Reznor beats. Where, I fucking hated it. Thanks, Grant. But anyways, here it's like Bowie's able to utilize that as a proper vessel. He's in love with the style. He thinks that it is the evolution of him as an artist, and he incorporates it in with his classic songwriting techniques, his really immaculate sense for, kind of hooks and melodies, which you don't necessarily always get in sort of industrial, but you can definitely discern sort of Bowie's sort of vocal patterns and really are able to grip into some of it. I will say 50 minutes, maybe a tad much. You could probably have gotten away with trimming a track, but I'm not even sure what you would do because I love basically every song here. As you mentioned, 7 Years in Tibet is great. The Last Thing You Should Do And obviously the big three, A Little Wonder, Unafraid of Americans, Battle for Britain. Just a really very strong album. I don't know why I can't get it to 4.5, but yeah, I genuinely think it's one of the most overlooked records of the 90s. It would make my top 10 in 97, so that is a very strong year. So number 9, Earthling, 4 stars.
Yeah, very interesting how we have our like, because I would say that Outside probably holds my like title for most underrated Bowie album. So I think it's interesting how it comes from the same period for both of us. As far as like, I feel like the 90s in general are just like his most underrated era. Like, I think people don't appreciate just how strong like the music he was creating was for the most part, because like the 70s stuff is so good that it just kind of suppresses everything else. Anyways, speaking of 70s, no, not 70s actually, 1980. Number 8, 1980s Scary Monsters. 4.5 stars, and my last 4.5 star album. I mean, 7 albums I got to 5 stars on, which is, I think, the most for any artist. I don't even think the Beatles have that many for me. So I think the Beatles have like 6. But yeah, so more reasoning why like this was an incredible dive for me to do again. Yeah, Scary Monsters is fucking fantastic. It's, perhaps the best, it has perhaps the best sounding guitars on any Bowie album. Having Robert Fripp coming back, working together with Carlos Alomar. So again, that kind of dual guitar sound that I was talking about before really gives these songs a nice crunchy sensation, which works really well amidst all the other kind of new wave textures that they have going on. I mean, the song Fashion, I think the song Fashion demonstrates everything that is excellent about this album. Like, all the appeal can be boiled down to that one song. But really, I think all of side one is almost perfect. It's phenomenal. Up the Hill Backwards, I mean, it's probably the weakest song, but I really like how it takes the Bo Diddley beat, the traditional Bo Diddley beat, and tries to transpose it over a 7/4 time signature. I think that's just a really bizarre choice that I really love. It's No Game, number 1, absolutely insane vocal performance, but he's just shrieking his way through it. Ashes to Ashes, everyone knows. Same with the title track, and Teenage Wildlife on the second side. Literally, the only downside I have is just I think it is technically front loaded. I think a lot of the weakest songs come on the second side. But otherwise, it's really well played. It's really strong. Tony Visconti has gone on record as calling this Bowie's best album, and you can feel where he's coming from. Obviously, I don't agree, but you can feel where he's coming from. A lot of these songs have hooks and melodies that are very reserved and not obedient, but once you've sat with them a little bit, they really open themselves up, and you're like, wow, that's really clever. That's a really clever melody David Bowie just wrote here. Good job, David. And yeah, it's really, really strong. It's a really strong record. And again, it's strong 4.5 on the cusp of 5, and it might get to 5 one day. But as I've said, there are 7 albums that I like more somehow. This is a record that most artists from the 80s or any time would kill to have as their best album. And I think Bowie has 7 albums that are better than it. So it's pretty absurd.
Absolutely. Now, I know that I said Earthling is probably his most underrated album, and I do agree to that because I see most people put it sort of near the bottom, in which I think it very much deserves to be at the very least in the top half. This is probably going by placement and as well star rating because I'm officially at 4.5. What would technically be his most underrated for me. I'm going with 2003's Reality. I feel like this album really just doesn't get discussed because I say that the most noteworthy thing about it is that album cover, which, to be as blunt as I can, is absolutely unbearable. I never want to look at it again because it is one of the ugliest things that he has ever put out there. Downside, the music attached to it is genuinely outstanding. I can't think of a single dud across the entirety of the track listing, and it may have some of his best covers across the entire career. I know that we keep saying that because he covers so many songs, but he is pretty much and arguably for me the greatest interpreter of songs of all time. What he's able to do with other people's work is genuinely outstanding. And on this album, you get that with his cover of Pablo Picasso, which is so much better than the Modern Lovers version. I like the Modern Lovers song, fine, it exists, but Bowie just shits all over it, man. I don't even know how else to describe it. Sorry, Eric. As well, I think his cover of George Harrison's "Try Some Buy Some" is as well excellent. His vocals, I never really did the comparison, but they are somewhat Harrison-esque in his higher range and sort of, I don't know. Maybe I'm grasping at straws, but I think that he sounds excellent over George Harrison's lyrics, and it really adds to this album. Nuclear Star is one of his best album openers ever. I adore the vocal performance in Never Get Old. I think that he sounds incredible. And past that, Looking for Water is probably the next big highlight. I'm not really sure what to say about this one because I don't necessarily think it's the individual songs that really elevate it into being as great of a record as it is. I think it's more so when it comes in his discography and just how strong front to back it is. The group of musicians he's working with on here are outstanding, pumping out some of his best arrangements, I would say, since maybe as long ago as like Let's Dance. And just track for track, it's hard to argue against it. Maybe it lacks some of Bowie's overall greatest highlights within his career, but it just has such a strong feel throughout. I think that it closes incredibly well with Bring Me the Disco Gang. Title track as well is incredibly strong. Really, the only thing I can knock against it is that god awful album artwork. I have it at 4.5 stars. I think it's an excellent album, and probably objectively his most underrated. But Earthling's cooler, so number, I believe this is 8, Reality.
I don't think that Bowie is the greatest interpreter of songs ever because Michael Bublé exists.
Fair enough. I forgot to account for that. You
Yeah.
you are true.
How could you
There's also
forget?
William Shatner. There's also William Shatner.
Exactly. See, I forgot Shatner. That's on me. Anyways, yeah. We're up to 5 stars, and we're going to be 5 stars for the whole rest of the way. My number 7, it's tough. This honestly, like 5 through 7 to me is the interchangeable piece. I think all of these could go in any which order on some level, depending on the day. Number 7, I'm going to go with 1971's Hunky Dory. I think the reason this is the lowest 5-star record for me is just that it is a little bit kind of ramshackle at times, a little bit like, I mean, there are definitely songs where it feels a little bit kind of rough sometimes, the playing. But again, it's all relative. It's all relative. I just needed an excuse to put something lower than the others. Huge right turn for Man Who Sold the World. Stylistically, in ways kind of a throwback to the first 2 albums, but with the added elements of a much better backing band. And Bowie's songwriting, this is the point where his songwriting takes a massive leap forwards, like that, to the point where I'm not going to use the word unequaled because I think that's an overused word, but it's hard to think of very many kind of artistic evolutions that were that quick, especially from a songwriting perspective. It's like night and day. By the way, we talked about influences, or you were talking about influences before a little bit, but Scott Walker, one that we need to kind of touch on a little bit. I definitely hear it at points on this album, and on a lot of his earlier stuff, really. The Spiders ensemble, one major addition here, obviously being Rick Wakeman. I think the piano that he adds really gives this album a sense of life. And it's interesting to think about an alternate reality where he joined Bowie's band full time. It kind of makes you shiver to think about how something like Ziggy Stardust could have been potentially even better with Wakeman in the lineup. I'm sort of grateful that he wasn't, because if he wasn't in the lineup, then we wouldn't have Mike Garson, who I do prefer. But still, Wakeman adds so much to this album. Life on Mars, everybody knows. I don't need to say that much about it. It is a fantastic vocal. Fantastic bit of songwriting and song structuring. Um, Changes. Changes is a song that almost shouldn't have worked as a single because the rhythm of the vocal line is so kind of offbeat. Like it really kind of fucks with the listener's ear as far as like figuring out where the downbeat is. But it works. And in some ways, I feel like the hook plays around with that offbeat vocal line so well that it works because of the vocal. I don't know if that made any sense, but just really, really great stuff. Oh, You Pretty Things is fantastic. Quicksand is a super sweeping track with these really dark references to World War II. The Bewlay Brothers is such a strong closer. I think such great melodies in that one. My pick, though, the one that, like, if you ask me to pick a favorite right now, I'd probably pick this one. Is actually maybe the most ragtag song of all, just from a jamming perspective. Andy Warhol. I adore Andy Warhol. That is so much fun. The intro, I think, is off the wall but hilarious, and then the guitar lines that like Bronson and Bowie are playing are phenomenal, phenomenal. So yeah, I advocate for that song whenever I can. Um, but yeah, it's a 5-star album. 6 ones I like more, but it's a 5-star record, and it's potentially, I would say potentially his most important. I would say in terms of his evolution as an artist, if he doesn't have Hunky Dory, he doesn't have anything else. Um, I think if he hadn't hit the nail on the head with that one, you know, hard to say how we'd remember him, but he does not have nearly the same evolution if this one doesn't work in the way that it does.
It's tricky because in some ways I think that you're correct about the evolution aspect, but I don't know. Because I feel like, if we're being honest, it's kind of a weird intersperse between The Man Who Sold the World and Ziggy. Because Ziggy is the more direct sort of rock follow up, whereas Hunky Dory is more intimate, it's more self contained. He doesn't really revisit it very much in his catalog, despite the songwriting, I would say.
Yeah, I think the songwriting is the key though. Like I
That's
think if he doesn't take that huge of a leap in his songwriting in this setting, then Ziggy never happens. Or if Ziggy happens, it's like, you know, 20% as good. Like
To be fair, in that reality, he could have gotten Rick Wakeman for that album because Ziggy would have been earlier.
it's true.
I don't know. It's tricky. Reality, I would say, is firmly my 8, but these next batch, or this is where things get tricky. I think it was my 8. We'll say it was my 8. Next up, I think I'm going with Alladin Sane. His most iconic album artwork was on the Great British Bake Off. Never seen that show. I just saw the cake. There you go. And yeah, I would say this is kind of the hard rock take on Ziggy, described as Ziggy Takes America, and you can definitely feel it at points. The opener, Watch That Man, is excellent. The title track, Alladin Sane, is really great. I'd say this is a weirder variant upon that. You get sort of more of the creativeness, the more sort of out of the box thinking that was on a record like Hunky Dory and some of the other moments. We still have the kick ass band and sort of groove that you got from Ziggy. I would say that the main thing that puts this below is their cover of the Stones, Let's Spend the Night Together, which I do like that song. I think that he does a fair version of it, but it might be my least favorite cover that he did because for me, it's one of the few times I think that he doesn't elevate a song. I think that Stones song is basically perfect. Between the Buttons is my favorite Stones record whenever I get to that, and that is an excellent track off of there. But even despite that, this is still an incredible album. The Gene Genie in the back half is incredible. And really, it's just, I feel like Ziggy Stardust, as great as the performances are on there, I do think in some ways the band is still fully coming together. I think on here they've really sort of gelled as a group, and it's very comparable in that sense to, say, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road to Captain Fantastic in that sense. Look at that. Bring it all back home with Elton John. There you go. But yeah, Aladdin Sane, 4.5 stars. Great album. Not much more to add.
You just said the sentence, bringing it all back home with Elton John. So you referenced Bowie, Elton, and Dylan all in the span of like 2 seconds. That's really impressive.
Hey, somebody had to do it.
I suppose. Um, okay, no wrong answers at this point. I have what is, I don't know. I guess this is not the stereotypical top 6, because I think there's enough people who wouldn't have Blackstar that high that I don't think this is like a given. But in any case, number 6, 1977's Heroes. Um, yeah, absolutely remarkable side one. I would say this is the best side one in the whole Bowie catalog. Um, the title track in itself is just, it's an amazing bit of song craft, both in the songwriting. I think the songwriting itself is really effective, but also in the recording. I think the recording makes it. Just the steady buildup, all the kind of layers that they add in, the studio tricks where they're using those microphones further and further away from him, so you're getting more of like the room noise and the wider reverb and stuff like that, and they just build it up more and more. It's just really effectively done. um Absolutely fantastic. The track that I will defend more than most on here, though, and I know people like this song, I'm not saying it's hated, but Joe the Lion. um some of my favorite, I'm coming back to the dual guitar thing, some of my favorite dual guitar work on any song ever. Fripp gets all the credit and deserves a lot of it, but Carlos Alomar's in there too. And the two of them are kind of like dueling each other and like adding to that kind of cacophonous noise. They bounce off of each other so damn well. And if you hear what, like, I'm 99% sure it's Fripp at the end who's just like popping off with these like, you know, free jazz inspired solos or whatever that's buried in this loud noise. Bowie's vocal is insane on this track. I adore it. It's probably a top 5 Bowie song for me, if I'm being honest. And yeah, the whole first side is excellent. Not as high on it as low, because I do think the second side is weaker, because I think it is closer to quote unquote standard Brian Eno rather than exceptional Brian Eno. And I'll explain that more when we get to low. I will say I agree with you. I love Moss Garden. I think Moss Garden is beautiful. But again, I do think it's a weaker side too, but it's a damn fine record, like overall across the board. I think it's really sharp. And I guess in some ways you could argue it's like it's the Berlin album with the least clear identity, because it kind of blends all of the different things that they're exploring into one record. And so in some ways, like if someone were to tell me Heroes was their favorite Berlin album, I'd be like, yep, that makes sense. That makes total sense. It's not mine, and it's obviously not yours. So, but we'll get to both of those in due time. But 5 stars, my number 6, Heroes.
Absolutely. I'm looking over it now. I'm not sure if that's quite the biggest discrepancy between yours and my list, because I think it battles it out with this one, my number 6. Let's Dance. I have this at 4.5 stars. Definitely one that I was not expecting to be this high going into it, but I mean, just laying it out there. The singles, I understand them. Are they the best songs on this album? Yeah. The rest of it's great, though. I mean, it's just an excellent pop album. The one thing I want to bring up, especially here, is the guitar playing. It's Stevie Ray Vaughan, but it doesn't feel very bluesy. It doesn't feel very rooted in what he would typically do. It's very interesting just to hear him operate under this. Regardless, though, what I'm here for is just Nile Rodgers. His production is sensational. For my money, this is Bowie's best vocal album. I think that his voice is outstanding across here, especially on Modern Love, which between that and another song I'm going to talk about fairly soon, very high up there for my favorite Bowie vocal performance. As well, as much nonsense as he's saying throughout those verses, that song is just an undeniable pop gem. Same thing kind of goes for China Girl and of course the title track, Let's Dance. But where I think that it really shines is in that back half. The lesser known songs, the lesser utilized, which I just think are absolutely sensational. Of course, the biggest one of that batch is Ricochet. Really out there, really weird. You're still getting some of those Scary Monsters Lodgers quality, but it's fit into a more generalized pop sound, and it's able to really elevate itself there. But there's more songs. I really love the closer Shake It this go around. And Without You, I think, is a real gem across here. I understand why people would put this lower, because I feel like the more populist Bowie gets, the less people like him sometimes. People are very much wanting him to be this experimental giant, this pillar of what rock music can be with what all he's able to do and how chameleon-esque he is. However, whenever you really boil it down, Bowie is just an incredible songwriter, one of the greatest of all time. He is one of the greatest singers of all time, and just simply put, can just orchestrate a group of musicians. I don't know how much input he has on what people are playing, but you gotta assume he's in there, sort of jamming out with everybody, sort of figuring out what all he wants for his albums. And I don't know, I just think that Let's Dance is a great showcase of pop craft. For my money, one of the best pop albums of the 80s. It's a true highlight. Number 6, 4.5 stars.
It's cool. Yeah, I think it's between that and Outside, because I think it's the same difference between all those records for us, if memory serves.
Possibly, yeah, because Outside was my 23, I believe.
Yeah, so somewhere around that, but
in that range.
Yeah, I think with Bowie it depends. Like, I think there are some albums where he is like, the kind of studio tyrant, if you will, where he's like, telling everybody what to do. He's like Brian Wilson up in people's shit. No, play this like A flat slightly better. I don't know. And then there are other records where, and I think Let's Dance might be one of them, if I'm remembering what I've read before, where he's like not really involved. He's just kind of like, all right, go on then, play a tune. I'll contribute some lyrics eventually. After I finish the Coke, of course. But yeah. So I think it kind of depends. It kind of depends with him. But yeah, he works with musicians like either way, like about as well as any artist ever, and he's a very excellent judge of talent too. Speaking of working well with musicians, my number 5, 1973's Alladin Sane. 5 stars again. As you said, and as they all say, Ziggy goes to America. And it's pretty obvious. There is a lot of there are people out there who really do think this is like Ziggy Part 2, and I don't agree. There's so much in the way of jazz, doo-wop, and blues rock influences here that Ziggy doesn't have, at least not as obviously, that I can't compare the two. I think this is markedly different in a lot of ways, even though there's only a year's difference between the release. Let's talk about Mike fucking Garson. Oh my God. His piano on this album is insane. It's absolutely incredible addition. The title track creates such a foreboding atmosphere, and the little like atonal flourishes and that solo that he does, that Garson does on it, are crucial for that atmosphere. And then Lady Grinning Soul, like the little, twinkling he's doing with the right hand. Pretty sure it's just the right hand, mind you. Like, it's absolutely insane. He adds so much to this album alone. It's just a shame that he's not appeared on more Bowie albums than he actually did. Love the blues rock influence in Cracked Actor and the Jane Genie. Love the 50s nostalgia of Drive-In Saturday too. I even like the Stones cover. I like that fair enough. I think the only point of criticism is that because it is so obviously based off of American influences, it makes it more obviously derivative from other things than Ziggy Stardust is. And that's the one thing that I hold against this record slightly. But it is a strong collection of songs. It's a strong collection of performances. I will agree with you that I do actually think that Alladin Sane might have a better, stronger band than Ziggy Stardust does. In fact, I definitely think that even if they took Garson away, I think it would be a stronger band. And yeah, this is an album that I always had kind of in the lower regions of my top 10 as kind of a pretty consistent, like 4 to 4.5 star album. But this was one of the ones that grew on me. It really clicked. And 5 stars. What else is there to say? Fantastic.
Nice. Yeah, that's another one that took me a while to grow. I heard it once. I had it 4 stars, probably in like the lower, like mid to high teens, I would say. At one point, it's grown up to my number 7, however. It's a great album. And next up, Another one I feel like I need to do some explaining for because it's another one that I think is very overshadowed by other albums, notably the two just before it. I'm talking, of course, about Lodger. It's always been my favorite Berlin era. At one point, it was my favorite Bowie album. It's not quite there anymore. And I don't know. Everybody makes Talking Heads comparison. I made the Talking Heads comparison. If you see my Talking Heads video, I like this more than any Talking Heads album. So shoot me. I don't know. I think that Eno and Bowie are working in just full force across here. And it doesn't have that slight issue that you could have with the Berlin era. It's more straightforward front to back. It's essentially them taking the experimentation and the wild energy that they had upon Low End Heroes, condensing it down into a pop landscape and adding in some of the Talking Heads influence that, had. And alongside that, Bowie just crafts a great batch of songs. Fantastic Voyage, American Night Flight, Red Sails, DJ, Look Back in Anger, Boys Keep Swinging, and Red Money. That's 7 of the 10 songs that I would probably all give 4.5, 5 stars that I think are outstanding songs. I've heard some people say that there are some slight issues with the production. I don't quite hear it. I'd say that it's on par with the other two. And for me, it's just this and another record I'll discuss very soon. It's the best blending of the experimental with the poppy side of David Bowie's writing. And I still think that, once again, his performances on here are just great. DJ is a very high contender for my favorite Bowie song in general. And I don't know, this is one that I've heard very many people state it's very far below the other two, and it's not even close. And potentially even you, because I believe you only had 4 stars and the other two are 5s. But I don't know, just something about this one has always resonated with me far more. Maybe it's the more direct approach, maybe it's the less sort of complex nature of it all. But for me, it's just an incredible art pop album. And it's a 4.5 stars. Logic, number 5.
Nice. Yeah. I did laugh at one point because I think you called African Night Flight American Night Flight, and I just laughed at that because that sounds like I don't know what a song named American Night Flight would sound like, but it sounds really fucking boring, if I'm being honest.
Like the song that plays on the ferry ride to go see dolphins or something.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
It's the SeaWorld theme song.
Yeah. Oh god. David Bowie composes the soundtrack to SeaWorld. Amazing. Okay, number 4. This album grew on me. It did. It grew on me. And people are still going to be pissed that it's not number 1. 1972's The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. An album that has chronically been in that like 4.5 star range, finally got its way to 5 stars for me. But it's still number 4. And for the record, I don't know why it wasn't an immediate click. I think it's just I don't know. I gravitated more towards Bowie's experimental stuff when I first started listening to him. And this one was just kind of like, yeah, obviously really strong, but was never in like contention for number 1 or anything. But I think the appeal for this record is in its tightness. This album is so wildly creative while being so coherent and cohesive and tight, both thematically and in the musicianship. I think Bowie's vocals are phenomenal. I think his vocals are really, really good on Hunky Dory for the most part, but I think his vocals are more polished here. And the band really locks into all of these songs. They sound, again, Hunky Dory. My complaint was that it seems a little bit ragtag on certain tracks, a little bit messy, which I guess is part of the charm. But on Ziggy Stardust, they sound like they played these songs 1,000 times. They sound super well rehearsed, and it shows. I wrote in my notes, I've refrained from making this comparison. I made this comparison 5 fucking times in this video. There's a lot of Elton John in this music, albeit it's a bit heavier thanks to the presence of Mick Ronson. I think Bowie and Elton obviously bounce off each other a lot in the early 70s, and I think the kind of glam aesthetic, there's definitely some hints of what Elton was doing even at that time. And thematically, there's so much going on here. not getting into it, there's a lot of complex discourse around Bowie's own sexuality and whether or not he was truly a member of the LGBT community. Um, but even without getting into kind of the weeds of it, the fact that he addresses so many of those ideas and those like talking points in this album is pretty unique and pretty attention grabbing. Um, and I think it's really forward thinking for the early 70s, especially overall. Um, but yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think, you know, all the songs are highlights. All the songs are highlights. 5 Years is a fantastic opener. Um, Starman is great. Starman, I feel like, is kind of the, you know, the theme song of the album, if you will. It's kind of like the centerpiece. Um, you know, Lady Stardust, Hang On to Yourself, Ziggy Stardust, Suffragette City, Rock and Roll Suicide. It's all great. It's all great. And it's songs that most, you know, most people watching this video have grown up with on some level. And the appeal is obvious. And it's very interesting to kind of finally connect with it on the level that I feel like other people do. You know, I feel like this was an album that I was always kind of like, you know, held a little bit at distance from, but it finally clicked. It's finally 5 stars. It's just not number one. There's 3 albums I like more. I'm sorry, but I love it. It's all the same.
We just can't get away from this Elton John thing. It's not gonna happen until we cover Billy Joel. It's gonna keep happening, I suppose. We gotta figure out the true Piano Man, or is it shit? What's the name of the guy that you're fawning over? I'm blanking. Piano
Mike
Man.
Garson,
Yes, is he the true Piano Man after all this time?
maybe.
He's only the piano player. Anyways, number 4. Yeah, 4. Yeah, 4. Yeah. Anyways, going to his final release, 2016's Blackstar, actually dropping 1 slot from where I had it before, unfortunately. So at 4.5 stars. And I mean, this album's bleak. It is dark. To be blunt, the album that I maybe most compare it to is A Crow Looked at Me by Mount Eerie. It confronts death so directly, so bluntly. A track like I Can't Give Anything Away or Lazarus are just so intertwined with, you know, his cancer, his, you know, falling, if you will. The title track Blackstar is 10 minutes, but here's what I'll say about this album. Bowie experimented with ambient music in the past. He experimented with jazz in the past. Both of those things were heavy inspirations upon the genre of post-rock. In many ways, I would describe Blackstar as David Bowie's post-rock album. It works in many ways based upon atmosphere, based upon jazz grooves, jazz melodies. He was heavily influenced by To Pimp a Butterfly by Kendrick Lamar, and you can definitely hear it in the type of playing that's accompanying this. In many ways, I might argue this is one of his most complex albums from a strictly musical perspective. All of the arrangements are really out there. They're very spacey. They're very, I wouldn't say ambient, because you can definitely tell that there's plenty going on. To draw a comparison to a post-rock classic, I would say it's very comparable to something like The Spirit of Eden by Talk Talk, in the sense of Bowie just sort of yelling out through these really gorgeously produced and immaculately described soundscapes. I've heard some people say that they have issues with the track Sue. I understand why, but I think it's great. She's a Pity She Was a Whore is outstanding. Dollar Days lay the best near the end. And I don't know, there's just something about the rawness and the just sort of desolation that you feel on this album that it's hard to get from anything else that he's done. It's bar none his darkest release, and in many ways, I would say it's perhaps one of the greatest um, albums in relation to just sort of passing and your own loss in its own sense. It's absolutely heartbreaking that he released an album this, you know, I'm not even sure what really to say. It's almost heartbreaking that he passed so soon after this record's release, because I think if he had stayed alive and was able to see the reception that this album got, it really would have meant the world to him. Although he obviously saw some of it within those 2 days, I think that you get what I mean, because this is heralded as one of his best, even within his massive catalog, I would say. Number 4, Blackstar. Truly outstanding material.
Well said. My number 3 is the album that grew on me the most in this re-listen, 1976's Station to Station. An album that before was kind of fighting for a spot at the very bottom of my top 10, and depending on the day, might not even have gotten in there for whatever reason. I probably would have had it around where you have it right now. I think in some ways the problems that I had with Young Americans helped me appreciate this record more, because it takes all my problems with that album, eradicates them, and makes everything else that much better. I don't care if this isn't the best ever band lineup that he had. I think they sound phenomenal. They play with the idea of space so much, and there are so many different production ideas and flourishes that they kind of throw in on each of these songs. It really feels like, you want to talk about musically accomplished records, at least at that point, this feels like the peak as far as like what Bowie was doing on a musical level. Not necessarily like the greatest ensemble again, but like what he's doing, combination of ensemble performance and production, it feels like his most professional record to that point. Yeah, I mean the title track I think is incredible. It's this searing epic that throws in enough musical ideas to fill an album in and of itself. And I think all the other songs like combine these space focused production ideas with a sense of melody that, kind of like Scary Monsters, isn't really appreciated enough sometimes when people first dig into this record. I think these songs have fantastic melodies for the most part. I love the hooks on Golden Years and on TVC 1-5. And, Word on a Wing is fantastic. Stay is fantastic. The closing track, Wild as the Wind, a Nina Simone cover, shout out to Chris, that I have always adored. A cover so good that it won the approval of Frank fucking Sinatra, which Sinatra was not an easy guy to please, but you had, like, during this time period, you had Sinatra complimenting him. You had Bing Crosby saying nice things about Bowie, like during the context of that Christmas song that they worked on together. Like, they're two of the OGs as far as like major American recording artists go. For them to praise Bowie's musicality when Bowie obviously is in a space very, very different from them, a musical creative space that they did not engage with for the most part, says so much about Bowie's appeal, even in the mid to late 70s. Wild as the Wind is a phenomenal cover, phenomenal vocal performance. And yeah, I was honestly kind of shocked that I just had sort of not written this album off, but sort of like lost it in kind of the quagmire that is really strong Bowie records. And yeah, it is remarkable. It's a remarkably well done album, and I look forward to playing it again really soon. Obvious 5 stars. Obviously fantastic. Nothing else to say really.
Yep. I mean, I can't argue with much of what you're saying. I wish that I loved it as much as you do. It's still a very high floor. It's on the borderline of my top 10. It really is just me not loving the very opening of the album that is what knocks it down, because past that, I fully agree. It's by far his best musically up to that point. You could argue it's better musically than a record like Blackstar, but I don't know, just something about it isn't quite there for me. However, my top 3 at this point, I feel fairly definitive are my top 3. I equally feel like number 3, if I'm being honest, if I kept going back to this one, I feel like there's a point in which it could overtake as my number 1. However, today is going to be my final 4.5 stars. So I have 2 Bowie records of 5 stars. I'm going with 1980s Scary Monsters and Super Creeps. And shout out the album artwork. Might actually be my favorite that he's ever done. I really just think that's an excellent piece of artwork. And I'll let the cat out of the bag. Teenage Wildlife is my pick for Bowie's best vocal performance. I think that he is just absolutely insane across that track. It's one of his best written ever. Maybe at this point in time, I could go as far as to say my favorite Bowie song. although I wouldn't say it's his best. I think his best falls on Ziggy, but we'll get to that shortly. But I don't know, even then, both the It's No games are excellent. I really love Up the Hill Backwards. This title track is excellent. You can't talk about this album without going into intense detail about Ashes to Ashes, which you did, which congratulations. I did not think that was possible. It is truly one of his greatest singles of all time. It encapsulates a really great pop appeal, but you very clearly have such a dichotomy between what he's saying and the a very spacey but almost like hopeful um actual song to it. But he's basically just in the chorus stating that the character from Space Oddity has gone mad in that landscape that he was stuck in. And I need to listen to Space Oddity, Ashes to Ashes, then Lazarus one by one by one, because I feel like that would be a really enriching experience whenever I do that. I can't deny the first half is definitely better. And I do think it being 50 minutes is slightly too long. I feel like it could have done with a bit of trimming. But what is delivered here is borderline a perfect art pop album once again. It's just really anything you could have asked for from Bowie from the 80s. And I weirdly think it gets overshadowed because it comes directly after the Berlin era. It's right before Let's Dance. It occupies a very weird middle ground in his catalog. And I think that it does that incredibly well. It's a fantastic album. I want to go 5. I re-listen to it. I'll probably go 5. At the moment, though, I'm sticking at 4.5 stars for Scaring Monsters and Super Creeps.
One thing I didn't note before, but we have completely different top threes overall, which I suppose like Bowie's the type of artist where if it's going to happen to anybody, it's going to be with him. But it's still that's an interesting little curio I observed. All right, top 2 are both at the about as strong as 5 stars can get at this point. But my number 2 is going to be 1977's Low. Man, I this album. So after I heard Blackstar, I think Low was the next one I heard afterwards, and it was very well. I think I might have heard Ziggy before that, but Low came around very early in my Bowie exploration, and I remember just being kind of caught off guard by everything that was going on. Like this is a very, for someone who had no background listening to like krautrock or anything adjacent to that, this album was very not grating because I really enjoyed it. I knew there was something there, but it was very, very different experience. But much like Blackstar, that's what captivated me. That's what kept me coming back. Eno is everywhere here, everywhere. So naturally, like this is an album that just in general was going to sound very different from station to station. Although I will say the first side does seem to build off some of the more experimental aspects of station to station. I don't think they're completely different. I think there is a through line there. I could praise the production of this record, but in some ways I don't want to because I think the word production feels a bit simplistic for what Eno is doing here. I think this is sound design. The way he manipulates both synthesizers, guitar tones, vocal tones, and timbres and all those things. Tracks like Varsava, I think is how you pronounce it. Really play around with all this stuff to make something that sounds so artificial and non-organic, but in a way that just captivates me. As far as the first side goes, I think there's a lot of aggressive stuff, a lot of great percussive sounds. Love Sound and Vision, love Be My Wife. I love all of the songs. I don't know why I'm picking specific ones. I think they all work. And even though they're all like pretty short, I mean, especially coming off of Station to Station, like it's a very needed change in just kind of album flow as well. and requires Bowie to pull out an entirely different style of songwriting and arranging on some levels, which he, you know, succeeds in spectacularly. And then the second side, which is remarkable. It's some of the best ambient electronic music I've ever heard in my life. Subterraneans is a contender for my favorite Bowie song. And in fact, it might be. I might just go ahead and say it. Subterraneans is my favorite David Bowie song. I think the synth pads and stuff that layer it combined with the really low vocals that Bowie's producing here. We talk about his belting and stuff like that. That man had a great low range too, whenever he wanted to pull it out. And that evocative saxophone in the second half, it just every time I hear it, like I can feel like the hairs stand up on the back of my neck. It gives me chills, genuinely. And yeah, there's not much more to say. It's a fascinating album. It's obviously based off of records and genres that came before it. So I don't want to say that it created everything out of thin air because that's not true. But it's sort of like it sets the bar high. It sets an example, and it set an example for so many other artists and bands to come afterwards. And I adore every second of it. It's an incredibly strong 5 stars. But again, it's one album that I prefer.
Glad to hear. Anyways, low, it's a tricky one for me. I think I'm at the point in which I'm appreciating it more than I ever have before. However, I still don't think I'm quite there with it. I think that there's just a slight disconnect with me in the Berlin trilogy in general. I still think that it's excellent, but I don't know. The more that I'm listening, I think I'm just not the biggest Eno fan. I don't know. They do great things in Roxy music though, so I won't complain. Over my number two, I'd say ask 50 Bowie fans out there. I'd say this is probably the conventional top two. Don't hold me to that. At number two, I knew this was my number two going into it. It's going to be the Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. And it's in many ways a perfect rock album. It's hard to really say anything against this. Sequencing is sublime. The track listing is outstanding. The only thing that really isn't amazing is the random cover in the middle. It Ain't Easy, which is still a very good song, mind you, but I feel like you could have cut it and probably had a more concise, more realistic album to fulfill the concept that he was trying to do, which, mind you, is a concept album. But at the end of the day, if your concept album doesn't work as a proper album, who cares about the concept? On the plus side, this is arguably the greatest concept album of all time. David Bowie's songwriting here is just outstanding. 5 Years is one of the greatest album openers of all time. I think Soul Love is a really beautiful song that I wish T-Rex did. I think the Bowie version is excellent, but I'm just imagining Mark Bolan during like the Tanks futuristic dragon sort of period doing that with his classic soul. I feel like he's singing that naturally higher anyway. I feel like Mark Bolan could have just absolutely killed that song, but I'm not complaining about Bowie's. It's a 4.5 star song and a 5 star album, so nothing to complain about. Moon Age Daydream, I've gone on record before, probably my pick for the greatest rock song of all time. I think that if you really need to just pick out the perfect template for what a rock song should be, I don't see much better than that. Amazing solo, great verses, hooky chorus. You got the term Mama Papa. I mean, what can you say? It's the best one. But yeah. From there, Lady Stardust, Ziggy Stardust, there's some really beautiful moments. I do think the issue that I've had with Ziggy Stardust, which is why it's never been my number one, and I've struggled to even have it at 5 stars before, is I think that the highs are very noticeably higher than the lower notes on the album. I think that 5 Years, Moon Age Daydream, Rock and Roll Suicide, Suffragette City, tracks like that, Starman, they're obviously the apex of the album. But then you have a song like It Ain't Easy, you have Star, you have Hang On to Yourself, which are still good and work very well within the context of the album. But they're not like top tier Bowie. which is the disconnect that I've had, and which is why I have struggled to put this record at 5 stars before. I've grown, I can admit, just straight through. This is pretty much rock music boiled down to as perfect as it can be, in my opinion. And Rock and Roll Suicide, probably my pick for the greatest album closer of all time. I don't think that there's a better way to close out an album than that. One of his best vocal performances, especially within the 70s. For me, it's anything I want a rock album to be, except it's not made in the 2000s by some really edgy white dudes. So has to be number 2 for that. The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars.
All right. I will say to your point, there is definitely a variation of quality in Ziggy Stardust. And compared to other like kind of consensus classic rock albums from the 70s, like, I'll use Dark Side of the Moon as an example. Like Ziggy Stardust doesn't have an equivalent to like On the Run. Like the quality difference is not that massive. But but like I said, I get your point. Okay, number 1. What's the saying? You never forget your first. 2016's Blackstar, 5 stars. If you, I've said this now in our videos on Bon Iver and on Taylor Swift, but if you go to my YouTube channel, Music Deep Dive, I do a video about the 12, I think it's the 12 musical recordings or musical works that have the greatest influence on me. And Blackstar was one of them. I remember where I was the day that, Bowie died, and we found out about it. And I remember just kind of reading articles about it. Again, my background being I'd heard several songs, but never a full length album. And I watched the music video for Lazarus because people were talking about that connection, and I was blown away. And it wasn't that day, it was a few days later when I actually sat down and listened to the album. I think it was like in the evening while I was at work doing like data entry stuff or whatever the hell. And this album was so far beyond anything else that I had heard at that point, not in terms of quality. Like there's like I'd heard like the Beatles' White Album, at this point, or Abbey Road or whatever great Beatles album you want to use as an example. But just in terms of style, like I hadn't really sat down and listened to much jazz before this, much hip hop inspired music. And so this just kind of engaged my brain on a level that I was not used to. And, and in a lot of cases, like that was be kind of a turnoff. I remember hearing Death Grips for the first time and just being like, what the fuck is this? I'd never heard a hip hop album before, and I decided to jump straight into Jenny Death for whatever reason. But yeah, Money Story is their best, but for whatever reason, I jumped into Jenny Death. I don't know why, but I think it was their most recent at the time. Any case, Bowie did take inspiration from Death Grips for Blackstar as well on some level, which is interesting to me. But yeah, I mean, for the most part, that type of like immersion into something completely different turned me off at the time. And it didn't here. And I don't know why. I think it speaks to the coherence of the themes that he's working with. Like, this is an album about mortality. I think it is fascinating to think of this album when you realize the context of what he was going through, not in the sense that he knew he was going to die. He actually made most of this album while he was in remission and thought he was going to live. And he made this record kind of in a way similar to like how he did the next day. He was kind of reflecting on the idea that, wow, I just narrowly escaped death again. And that is his rumination on it. And then come around November 2015, I think, when they're filming the music video for Lazarus, is when he finds out your cancer's back and it's terminal and you've got like a few months to live. So in a way that makes it all the more heartbreaking. And it just adds that extra little layer to everything that he's doing, whether it's the actual music or the music videos. um, Talking about the music is remarkable. um, the ensemble that he has working with him, which he essentially poached out of like New York jazz clubs and stuff, is like absolutely fantastic. Um, Shout out to Donnie McCaslin on the saxophone. I think he adds so much to these songs. And because I'm a drummer, extra shout out to Mark Juliana on the drums. Sue or In a Season of Crime, which some people don't like, and I don't get it. The drumming on that song is like mind boggling to me, like what he's doing. He's changing the drum pattern on every measure, and it's just remarkable. And it's so frenetic. And then Bowie's like kind of gliding over with this very slow paced melody line. It's, it all comes together so well. You know, there are certain songs that don't obviously deal with the subject of death, but maybe kind of hint at it on certain lines, like Sue, "'Tis a Pity She Was a Whore," "Girl Loves Me," although that one obviously has the "Where the fuck did Monday go" line, which everyone was clinging on to. Um, but yeah, then you get to the title track, which is this just super epic piece, unlike anything else he ever did in general, and also a contender for my favorite Bowie song. Lazarus, I think a phenomenal song on its own. Combine it, compare it with the music video, and I think it just adds that extra level of feeling like a swan song again, even if that wasn't necessarily his initial intent. um Dollar Days is like a remarkable song. I adore the piano on that track. Oh my god. um and I Can't Give Everything Away is a goodbye. That's what it is. It's a little bit of, um I guess, kind of positivity. Like, I guess there's a little bit of a positive spin at the end. um but no, it's an album that deals with mortality and death head on as almost any other album that you will hear made by anybody. And it executes it better than I think any other album made by anybody about this subject. um and I think part of what helped it resonate with me too was just kind of the timing, in 2016 being such a chaotic year between this and between, we obviously lost Prince that year. We obviously lost Leonard Cohen that year after he put out his equivalent to this, in my opinion. I think You Want It Darker is my favorite Leonard Cohen album. And just kind of, all of these experiences, losing all of these kind of iconic artists in the same year, I think was what pushed me over the edge to getting to really properly explore music and explore it at like a breakneck pace. Because in my head, I'm like, I don't want to experience a Blackstar without having experienced what came before it, so I can really appreciate it and appreciate the artist in that context, and appreciate the artist before like they're no longer with us, I guess. So in a way, I don't know that this will ever not be number one, because there's so much, like, it has made more of an impact on my own musical development than almost any other piece of music ever. But even just on a musical level, I think, it stands up with anything Bowie ever did, as far as like artistic focus, as far as like musicality. And it's something where I can't listen to it all the time because it's a depressing record in a lot of ways, but it's something that I revisit really frequently. And I'm just kind of, I don't know, it's one of those things that reminds you of how great albums can be when there's a clear artistic vision, when there's a really fantastic ensemble, and when the songwriting and execution is top notch. It's as high as a 5-star can be, possibly a top 10 album for me of all time, definitely top 15 to 20, and terrific. I have nothing else to say about it.
Yeah, it's a hard one because I don't know if I could ever like actually put it as my favorite Bowie album because it's just, it's so dark. It's so hard to listen to in a lot of ways. I know I brought up A Crow Looked at Me. In other ways, it could almost be kind of comparable to, like, for me, From a Basement on the Hill by Elliott Smith, to where that's a challenging listen due to knowing the backstory behind it. So, if I may ask as well, this is kind of off topic, but I know that you're also a massive Prince fan. Who do you think personally impacted you most at that time? It's passing.
Well, here's the thing. Bowie, it was I honestly both the same, but in very different ways. Bowie, because I jumped right into listening to Blackstar after this and had like that whole musical experience. But Prince, I mean, I live in Minnesota. You cannot get away from like all the grief and all the outpouring of emotion and Prince just being on the radio like nonstop. And I mean nonstop, you know, watching people in the musical community who I knew literally like break down in tears talking about it. Like it's, I didn't click with Prince's music as quickly as I did Bowie's. Like I think I explored Bowie's discography in full like that year. And Prince, I don't think I did until like a couple years afterwards because there's even more with his catalog, which hopefully we'll get to one day. But yeah,
Happened in
both
December.
nice. Yeah, both were enormous. Both were enormous. As far as like major impacts on me. And if I had actually known their music well beforehand, it would have been even bigger. So
Probably so. Yeah, I'm three albums deep into Prince, so that's going to be something whenever that releases. However, my number one, it's a tricky one because it wasn't my number one initially. It was one that definitely had to grow for me, and I don't think it really clicked that this was truly my favorite until I purchased this. Which I could be wrong, but I believe this is an original pressing version of Hunky Dory that I found at like an antique shop. If not, fuck it, it's my original pressing, so take that, vinyl collectors. To me, this is the most kind of intimate, the most raw we ever saw Bowie earlier on. While still definitely writing from, the character perspective, you can tell so much of his influences through here. We never brought it up, but Bowie is was a huge fan of Velvet Underground. Incredibly influential on him. On pinups, they recorded a cover for Black Tie, White Noise that went on to Mick Ronson's Play Don't Worry record. And Lou Reed was just a massive character, which is why you have a song like Andy Warhol. You also have Dylan, of course, with Song for Bob Dylan. Women with Queen Bitch was a big influence for him, but no, the songs here are just outstanding as well. Changes is one of his best openers of all time. I absolutely adore Oh You Pretty Things. Life on Mars, I love it, but it might not even be in my top half of this record because I think that it is just outstanding. Kooks is just so much fun. It's so jaunty. It's so jovial. This record has such a nice bounce, such a nice feeling to it. It's very much, it feels like him, piano, and just sort of the band behind him. To make one final Elton John comparison, this is his Honky Chateau, I feel. However, I would say it's a lot better than Honky Chateau because the songs here are way better. But I'll admit, I can notice the flaws on this album. I do think, as much as I love it, this is a flawed album. You have tracks like Eight Line Poem, you have Fill Your Heart. This is going to sound wacky, but I've never been a big fan of Queen Bitch. I can admit those aren't like top tier Bowie songs. The issue is the album feel is outstanding. I love the sound of this record. And whenever this album hits, it is among the best of his career. I love the 1-2 punch of Andy Warhol and Song for Bob Dylan. Despite them very clearly being based upon his influences, they're still so weird and out there with Bowie's other influences that he's drawing from for those songs. The close of the Bellway Brothers is super unique, super interesting. And I love the side one, side two of it as well to bring in the vinyl because, flex. But yeah, for me, it's just the Bowie album that I draw the most personal connection from. I feel like it's the one that was most developed with, the person, David Jones, David Bowie, as opposed to the character of, Ziggy Stardust, Thin White Duke, whatever the hell he was on Earthling, I feel like this is truly the expression of David Bowie as a human, and him with one of the best lineups he would have, which it's hard to deny. That was David Bowie. Any closing thoughts on this man's crazy career?
Yeah, I think it's just, again, sitting through all of it. Because I, like you, blazed through this. I think I had a couple of days off in the middle, but I think Diamond Dogs onward I did in the span of about 2 days. So I being able to really sit with this catalog for the first time in a while just really emphasized how genuinely great it is. And I think in a weird way, as strange as it sounds, I had underappreciated some of the 70s stuff because I was very much championing his 90s output, his 2000s and 2010s output. And while I still do appreciate and champion those records, it was nice to kind of really sit back and appreciate again just how diverse his 70s work is and how many genres, many approaches, artistic ideas he's dealing with during that time. Very, I would say Beatles like, but in a way it's like Beatles on steroids, which is how many ideas he just kind of plays around with. And he's like, all right, I'm done now. Let's try this thing. And just continues building on himself. So I'm not a complete fanboy. It's interesting how I went lower than you did scores wise, but had more 5-star albums than you as well. Um, but yeah, I think it cements him as one of my favorite artists. How could he not be with 7 albums that I think are, more or less perfect or close to it? It was a great experience to re-listen to it all.
I feel like I can just come out and say it at this point. As much as I've tried to lie to myself and say, no, it's the National, no, it's Amy Mann, no, it's ELO. At this point in time, I can probably confidently say David Bowie is the most important artist to my musical evolution and probably my favorite at this point. Which is weird to think because I have 4 5 stars for the National, 4 for Amy Mann. I think actually 5 for Amy Mann, but I only have 2 for Bowie. But at the same point, 25 for 25 records that I think are genuinely good that we counted. Arguably, only one proper misstep, which is a soundtrack for me, which wouldn't even really be relative to count for this sort of thing. It's hard to deny the overall impact and importance an artist like David Bowie has had on my evolution as not even just a musical lover, just as a person in general. So, yeah, he's pretty good, I guess.
I am curious, just for posterity's sake, what would you rate Buddha of Suburbia?
I think I had it either 2.5 or 3 my first go around, but I did not re-listen to it for this. I could see it growing because Outside grew a fair bit as well. So
Makes sense. And have you heard the Tin Machine albums?
I have not heard the Tin Machine records. I've also not heard pinups, weirdly enough. Just never got around to it.
I think pinups you'll like. I think the Tin Machine records, I don't know. You've been positive on so much of Bowie that I don't think you'll dislike them as much as I do. And I don't hate him. I just think they're much less essential in his catalog than pretty much anything he did as a solo artist.
Fair enough. That being said, though, 25 records. A slightly long episode here. That was David Bowie. My personal favorite member of the Monkees. That being said, I hope that you all enjoyed this and you had a good time.